Hi everybody, and welcome to the first Racetrack Builder tutorial, version 2. Now it's version 2 because it's been remade to take advantage of some of the features that weren't available in the initial release. It's still the introduction tutorial, so if you're looking to get an idea of what Racetrack Builder is and how you would get started using it, this is the one you want. Now Racetrack Builder, as you might have guessed, is about building racetracks. Specifically elevated racetracks, so you can create things like roller coasters with jumps, loops and banked corners. And for this tutorial we will be creating a figure 8 racetrack circuit which jumps over itself in the middle, and we'll be testing it out with the car from the Unity standard assets package. And finally we'll add a few flourishes at the end, like banked corners and different track types. Okay, so let's begin. So the first thing we need to do is open Unity, go to the Asset Store page, search for Racetrack Builder, purchase it, and import it. And we can just leave everything selected and click Import. And that will go away and do its thing for a bit. Right, so that's created a Racetrack Builder folder in our project. And a couple of things to note, we have the documentation PDF, and that contains the documentation about all the Racetrack Builder features and components and everything that we cover in this tutorial as well. And we also have an example scene that you can examine. For this tutorial we'll be creating our own scene from scratch, however. So we're just going to start with the default empty Unity scene with just a camera and the light. And the first thing we need to do is add some ground to go underneath the racetrack. And to keep it simple for this tutorial, I'm just going to use a basic plane. So right click, 3D Object, Plane. Make sure the position is reset. And I'll just set the scale, the X scale and the Z scale to 200. Okay, so now we're ready to add our racetrack, and that is simply right click, 3D Object, Racetrack. So we can see we've got a racetrack object that represents the racetrack as a whole, and underneath it we have this curve object which is basically a short piece of the racetrack, and we can see that on the screen here. So the first thing we need to do is move the racetrack up above the ground a little bit. And it's important to make sure we select the main racetrack object, because that's the one that represents the racetrack as a whole. If we were just to move the curve, then we'd just be moving a piece of the racetrack, and that's not what we want. So move that up to about there. So let's have a look at these objects. We have the racetrack object, and that is controlled by a racetrack component. And that has a bunch of parameters and actions that relate to the racetrack as a whole. Now we won't need to touch these for this tutorial, except that we will use the create closed circuit function, as we'll see later. Where we'll be doing most of our work is with the curve objects. So if we have a look at this curve, now this curve is represented by a racetrack curve component, and we've got a number of controls here that allow us to control the shape of the curve. So we can set the length, we can set the angle that it turns, and we can set the gradient up or down, put a bank angle on it if we want to. Now we're not just limited to the values on the buttons, we can also use the sliders, or we can key in values to get the exact values that we want. However, you'll notice that the mesh model is not updating automatically in response to moving the sliders. It does update the curve that you can see, which tells you where the racetrack is going to go, but the meshes aren't updated immediately. And that is because the slight delay when you're updating the meshes tends to interfere with the sliders. So Racetrack Builder will simply leave that for later. And you'll notice this one curve button pops up here, and that's basically Racetrack Builder saying it's detected that there's a curve where the meshes are not up to date with the path of the curve. And we can simply click that button and it brings everything up to date. Okay, so for our figure 8 racetrack, we just want to start with a simple 50 meter straight piece. So I'll just clear the angles here. And then we want to build onto the end of it to start creating the top of our figure 8 curve. And to do that we want to add another curve. So we can just click this add curve button. And now we have a second curve. And that's basically what Racetrack Builder is about. It's a sequence of curves that define the shape of the racetrack. So I'm going to set this curve to a 90-degree right hand turn. And now I want to add another curve. And you'll notice that the other curve is also a 90-degree right hand turn. And that's because it uses the values from the previous curve as the defaults for the new curve. Now I'm going to add one more, and that gives us the top part of our figure 8. So now we're ready to start building the jump in the middle. So I'm just going to add another curve, straighten it out, set it to 30 meters long, and I'll set the gradient to negative 45 degrees. So that's forming our jump ramp basically. So you'll notice that everything looks a bit cramped here. So what I really want to do is make this loop a little bit bigger. And that means going back and changing the previous curves. And to do that is as simple as selecting the curve, and we can just change it. So I will set the length to 75 meters and do it with the next one and the next one. And that gives us a little bit more space. Right, so we're ready to create the jump. And a jump in Racetrack Builder is basically like a bridge, but it doesn't create the meshes. So that ends up leaving a gap in the racetrack, which is the part that you need to jump over. So I'll start by creating the middle of the jump, which will be the part with no meshes. So I'm going to create a 50 unit piece, and it starts at negative 45, so I'm going to bring it down to positive 45. So it gives us like a little bridge. And then next we can add a curve for the landing ramp, and we'll set that to 30 units and set the gradient back to 0. That gives us a nice symmetrical little bridge. And to turn it into a jump, we select the curve in the middle, but we want to remove the meshes. And if we expand this miscellaneous section, we have this is jump tick box. And we can just tick it, and that removes the meshes, and we have a little jump. Now obviously something doesn't look right here. We've got a nice symmetrical set of curves, but the meshes that it's generated look a bit wonky. And there's a simple fix to this, which I will show you in a minute. However, it's good to understand the cause of the problem. So when Racetrack Builder creates the meshes for a racetrack, it creates them from these objects called mesh templates. And they basically contain the meshes that Racetrack Builder will use to build the mesh model. And these mesh templates, the default ones that come with Racetrack Builder, they're all 30 meters long, or 30 units long. And what Racetrack Builder does is it lays them out end to end along the path that's described by the curves. So if we expand the curves, we can actually see we have these little pieces of racetrack, and they're all 30 units long. So what happens is when you get up to the jump, if the length of the curve leading up to the jump is not an exact multiple of 30, then we have a bit of a problem. So if we just hide this piece here, and let's have a look at this curve. It's a little bit hard to see with a white plain background. I might just quickly put a different material on it. That's better. So the white line here is the curve, and we can see the meshes go all the way up to nearly to the end of the curve, and then they stop. So Racetrack Builder has a problem now, because if it adds the other mesh in, it's going to overrun the end of the curve. But if it doesn't add it in, then it's not going to fully cover the curve. So what Racetrack Builder does in this situation is it just adds the mesh in anyway and lets it overrun. Now if that's not what we want, we actually have a tool to fix this. I'll just collapse these back up again. And to fix this issue, we click on the curve, which is our jump, or our ramp leading up to the jump. And inside this miscellaneous section, we have this align meshes to end tick box. So we can tick that, and you'll notice a couple of things. Firstly, it's aligned to the end. Secondly, Racetrack Builder is telling us that there's 4 curves that need to be updated, and we can see that the lines for these curves here have all turned to shades of grey. So that's Racetrack Builder. That's how Racetrack Builder tells us that these are the curves that it thinks needs updating. So we'll click the button and get it up to date. And now we have a nice symmetrical jump. It's also useful to understand how Racetrack Builder has solved this problem. And what Racetrack Builder does is it basically scales the meshes along the z-axis before they're fitted to the curves, so that the end of the last mesh lines up exactly with the end of the last curve. And in order so that no single mesh is scaled by too large an amount, Racetrack Builder will distribute that scaling back over the meshes for the previous curves. And we'll do that all the way back to another aligned curve where the meshes are aligned with the end of the curve. So if we had explicitly specified that on a previous curve, then it would go back to that point. But because we haven't, it will go back to an implicitly aligned point, which could be like the end of a jump, or in this case, it's all the way back to the start of the racetrack. Okay, so let's carry on and build the rest of our racetrack. So I'll just select the last curve, add another curve, you can set the length to 75, I might make a 90-degree left-hand turn this time, and then just add 2 more curves. So that's nearly our full racetrack, and now we just need to connect it up. Now in the previous version of this tutorial we had to create a straight piece and fiddle around with the shape of the racetrack until they happen to match up. So it was a very manual process. However, now we can click on the racetrack and click this create closed circuit button, and there we are, we have a closed circuit. Now Racetrack Builder uses a Bezier curve to close the circuit, and that does a pretty good job of making sure it goes from where the end of the last curve was to the start of the racetrack. However, if the last curve and the start of the racetrack don't align cleanly, you're going to get this little bit of an S-bend. And there's not much Racetrack Builder can do about that. So that's something we need to take care of manually. And the easiest way to do that, just switch to the top view. So I need to move things around a little bit so that this piece will line up vertically with that piece. And the way to do that is if we select our jump curve, and you notice I can see that this is a jump curve because it's got no meshes underneath it, so there's no expand button. And we can just grab that handle and drag it until it's straight. And once again, if you're dragging the handles on the screen, it doesn't update the meshes immediately, so we need to click this button here to bring everything up to date. And there we go. So now we've got a nice straight join. So let's just have a quick look at the last curve, the bit that joins the racetrack up again. And you might notice if we select the first curve and the last curve, there is a little bit of overlap again. Now Racetrack Builder does its best to hide this overlap from you. And it actually does that by moving down one of the meshes very, very slightly to avoid some Z fighting on the top surface. But you will notice if we look at the side, we get some Z fighting along the side. We don't have to put up with this though. We can actually remove the overlap altogether. And that's simply by selecting the curve, the last curve, and we can use our align meshes to end function again. And once again it will tell us we need to update some curves. Now usually Racetrack Builder does a good job of keeping track of what needs updating and updating it for you. But sometimes it can get a bit confused, and it looks like it's got a bit confused now. So if you think you've got into this type of situation, the fix is just to select the main racetrack object and click Update Whole Track, and that will basically fix everything up for you and bring you back to ground truth. So if we examine this last curve now, we should see that we get a nice, clean, seamless joint, apart from a possible texture seam. It's generally fairly subtle, unless you're looking very closely. Okay, so now we have a complete circuit. Let's test it out. And we can do that using the car from the Unity Standard Assets package. So go back to the Asset Store, search for Standard Assets. So I'll import that. Now to save time we don't have to import everything. So I'll just clear everything, collapse it up. But we need a cross-platform input. And right down the bottom, you should have car, which is inside the vehicles folder. So we just need those two. Right, we'll go back to our scene. Now inside the projects folder, there should be a standard assets folder, car, and then prefab. Sorry, standard assets, then vehicles, then car, then prefab. And we can just grab the car, drop it on there, and we'll rig up the camera behind the car. So if we drag the camera, drop it onto the car so that it's a child, can reset its transform. If I just grab that little red square, I can drag it out behind. So this is a very crude third-person camera, but it will do for this tutorial. And let's give it a go. Okay, so I didn't make the jump, and now I've got a problem, because it's an elevated racetrack. how do I get back on? Obviously it's not going to be much of a game if you have to restart it every time you fall off the track. So fortunately we've got a component to help with that. And that is called a Racetrack Progress Tracker. And what we do is we add that to the car, and that will basically track our progress around the racetrack. And it also has this auto reset function. So this off-road timeout says once you've been 10 seconds off the road, it will just automatically put you back on the road. So if we run the game now, we should be able to see that the current curve is counting up as we progress onto the next curve. So if I fall off the track, there's the off-road timer, and once it gets to 10, we're back on the track. However, this still isn't ideal because it hasn't given us enough run-up to actually make it over the jump. So we can do something about that as well. I'll just stop the game. And if we go back to the curves leading up to the jump, such as the jump ramp itself, expand the miscellaneous section again, and we have this little can respawn tick box. And by default that's ticked. Now if we untick it, what that's saying is that we can't respawn the car on that curve. And I'll go back a couple more. So we'll untick it for that curve and untick it for this curve. And what that means is if you fall off the racetrack on any of those curves, Racetrack Builder will automatically take the car all the way back until it finds a curve where can respawn is ticked. And we can use that to make sure we allow enough run-up for things like jumps. Now occasionally Racetrack Builder needs you to regenerate the track in order for it to notice these settings. So I'm just going to click Update Whole Track, and there we go. So let's give it a go. I fall off here, select the car again, where is it? And there we go. Let's put us back a little way from the jump, and that gives us enough track to build up some speed. And there we go. Okay, so we have a fully drivable racetrack now. The last thing we want to do is add a couple of flourishes. We'll create some banked corners, and we'll change the track types to make it a bit more interesting. So we'll start with the banked corners, and that's just a matter of selecting the curve and put a slight bank angle, maybe 30 degrees. And you may notice that the bank angle setting is for the end of the curve. So it will start from the angle that you have at the start of the curve, which by default is 0, and then it will basically interpolate it along the curve, so that by the end of the curve it's got to the angle that you want. So we'll go to the next curve, and we'll set a 30-degree angle there, and then we'll just let the next curve, we'll leave it back to 0 so that it straightens out before the jump. And we'll go to the curves on the other side, and 30-degree angle in the other direction, and this one as well. So that's it. So let's have a look at the track types. Now to change the track type in Racetrack Builder, we have a look in the Racetrack Builder Prefabs Track Templates. And we've actually got a higher res subfolder in there. And the higher res models have a slightly higher resolution visual model and collision model, and they generally work a lot better, especially if you've got banked corners. So I tend to recommend just using them by default, unless you've got a very low polygon count, if you're building for a mobile device perhaps. But even then, wait and see if you've actually got some performance issues before using the lower res versions. So to set the track type, we have this template property of our curve. And if we go back to the first curve, we can see that that one's been set to asphalt poles. So if I click that, and we can see it's there inside our project. So I'm going to go into the higher res folder, and what have we got here? Asphalt poles, barriers. We'll use that one. So I'll select the first curve and drag that on there. And we can see that it's changed it immediately for the first couple of curves. Now it's actually telling us we've got 9 curves that need updating. So what happens is when you set the template on a curve, that becomes the track type from that curve onwards. And it stays that track type until you change it to something else. Now if we look at the subsequent curves, the mesh template is set to none. So that means we're not specifying a track type, so we're just using the same track type as the previous curve. You might be wondering why the new track type only goes up a couple of curves, and that's basically how Racetrack Builder updates the track by default. If you make a change to a curve, it will update that curve and often the next curve, but for performance reasons it doesn't immediately update the whole track. So instead it'll give you this button that you can click to catch everything up. So the next thing we can do is let's change our jump ramps. So I'll select the ramp, and I'm going to use this wood planks. It's actually called wood planks poles. So drag that on there, and if I let it update all the curves now, we'll update the entire rest of the track. So what I can do is select this curve immediately after the down ramp, and we'll set that back to our asphalt poles barrier and update the track. And for the last change, let's make the straight piece into a tunnel. So we have this asphalt poles tunnel, and I'll drag that onto the first curve. Now we need to set the second curve back to our barriers, and also select the last curve and set that to the tunnel. Okay, so if we look at our tunnel, you notice it curves a little bit at the end. It's like it's picked up a piece of these curves, and the reason for that is that the meshes aren't quite aligning with the end of the curves again. So if we want the tunnel to be a nice straight bit, we can simply use our line meshes to end feature again. So select the curve, expand miscellaneous, and tick line meshes to end. And we need to update some other curves, and we can do the same thing for the end of it. Now we need to make sure we select the curve before the tunnel, because we want to align the changeover to the end of this curve here. So tick line meshes to end, update the curves, and there we go. So let's try it out. So there we have it, a nice symmetrical little course with banked corners and different track types that's fully drivable. I hope you can see that Racetrack Builder is easy to get started with and a lot of fun. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments or the Unity discussion forum, and as always, thanks for watching.